Today's deck is one that is near and dear to my heart, as I've loved playing this style of Magic deck ever since I started getting into the competitive side of the game. Mono black decks using resource denial as a main game plan have been a thing for a very long time, even before Thoughtseize was printed, if you could think back to that far. While Pioneer isn't as powerful as Modern or Legacy and the counterparts to this deck in those formats, there is a card that is starting to see lots of play, one that was originally voted on for the Magic community to be created the way that it is. Let's walk through Wastenot's main deck, how it looks to sideboard, and what the play patterns will look like and how it stacks up against the Pioneer metagame. Now, as I mentioned, the Wastenot deck is a resource denial deck. You can kind of think of this style of play as a control deck, only instead of counterspells, you're going to look to take away cards from your opponent with discard effects, getting rid of recursive threats from the game entirely with some graveyard hate, and even attack the land base of some of the greedier decks in Pioneer. While most of the time it's going to be trading one of its cards for one of the opponent's more threatening ones, there are cards in the deck that are looking to safely beat down our opponents once they're unable to respond to them, or capitalize on the act of discarding in and of itself. Overall, games with the Wastenot deck are slow, grindy bouts that end up with both players in top deck mode or pretty close to it. However, the Wastenot deck has some tools that allow it to try to stay ahead on cards while simultaneously preventing the opponent from escaping its death grip. The Namesake card of our deck is also the engine that allows us to grind through the low resource gains with explosions of speed when it needs it most. Wastenot is a 2-mana enchantment that capitalizes on the main theme of our deck being discard spells. Whenever an opponent discards a creature, we'll get a 2/2 zombie. Whenever they discard a non-land, non-creature spell, we get to draw a card. And lastly, whenever they do discard a land card, we generate 2 black mana. This card is the engine that makes our deck go from a crawl to a full-on sprint in games. Combined with the rest of our spells, Wastenot turns our normally 1-for-1 discard effects into cantrips or board presence. Any of our spells that discard multiple cards from our opponent's end wind up being 3-for-1s or more with a Wastenot in play. Even if our opponent pitches just a land, we usually generate more mana than we spent on our spell, meaning it's sort of like a mini ramp card in order for our deck to play multiple spells in a turn or ahead of our curve. Better still, the effects add up when you have multiple copies of the enchantment in play, so a Thoughtseize turns into a divination if you hit a non-creature spell. Of note, cards with cycling must be discarded as part of the cost, so that means all the Triomes and Shark Typhoons will trigger Wastenot for mana or drawing a card. To go along with our engine, we pack our deck full of discard effects starting from 1 mana. Pioneer All-Star Thoughtseize takes center stage in this deck as a way to trigger 2/3 of our Wastenot, giving us the choice of which we want while denying our opponent of a needed card. 2 life is a small cost to pay when it discards an opposing win condition, be it a creature, spell, or planeswalker. Duress tag teams with Thoughtseize as extra copies that can't hit creatures, but still allows us to take away some threatening cards. Duress with Wastenot out will always draw us a card to replace itself, so long as our opponent doesn't have a fistful of lands in hand. Go Blank has seen up to 4 copies in main decks of Wastenot for a few reasons. Although a 3-mana discard 2 isn't the greatest rate of all time. Looking at you, Mind Rot. The fact that Go Blank also exiles the opponent's graveyard is what makes it so appealing to Pioneer pilots right now. With decks like Phoenix, Amalia, and Lotus Field looking to leverage their graveyards in some way, shape, or form, Go Blank not only gets rid of the current cards in hand, but has the upside of getting rid of them for the rest of the game entirely. Once considered one of the most powerful planeswalkers ever printed, Liliana of the Veil's power level has come down quite a bit thanks to the passage of time, allowing her to be reprinted recently into the Pioneer format. Liliana is at her best in Waste Not, as all of her abilities match up with the game plan the deck wants to be executing. Liliana's +1 does make both players discard a card, but it also doesn't target, so it gets around some protection spells. The -2 ability makes sure that we can clear the board of things like a problematic Vein Ripper or a big Voltron'd up heroic threat. And all you have to do is read her quote-unquote ultimate ability to see how the resource denial deck would love to have Liliana -6 against their opponent, literally destroying most of their resources in play, and most of the time, locking them out of the game in the process. When things can't get discarded from our opponent's hand, it needs to be dealt with in another way. That's where the removal package in the Waste Not deck comes into play, with a plethora of different spells for different threats. Bitter Triumph is a catch-all card for both creatures and planeswalkers, although it can be a little painful, either costing us a card from our hand or 3 life to remove it. Although our life total is going to be under pressure from thought seizes of our own, in addition to anything our opponent hits us with, the upside of killing most things in Pioneer outweighs a little bit of pain. Go for the Throat is another 2-mana Doomblade effect that takes out almost all of the creatures in Pioneer, save for a few cards that happen to also be artifacts. Most other cards in this slot have much harsher restrictions, so Go for the Throat often takes the last spot in the deck list for being the least restrictive of the bunch. Heartless Act, however, is one of those 2-mana removal spell variants, being unable to kill creatures outright if they have counters on them, which is a pretty bad restriction in a format with heroic decks flying around. Normally viewed as a large downside, Heartless Act has a second mode that comes in handy when facing down Archfiend of the Dross. Removing 3 oil counters makes your opponent lose on their upkeep if they can't get rid of their own demon. This one is more of a meta call and can just be extra copies of Go for the Throat or Bitter Triumph, so long as you're not facing down things like Izzet and Soul every single round. Fatal Push is the best 1-mana removal spell for creatures in Pioneer. Full stop. Able to take things down like Ledger Shredder and Amalia, Push can also deal with Sheoldred the Apocalypse so long as we've been able to trigger Revolt. Waste Not has a slightly harder time doing this than, say, the Rakdos lists do because they have blood tokens and treasure tokens, but being the best in slot spell for the job means Fatal Push isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Sheoldred's Edict is a way to deal with the same types of things that Bitter Triumph does, but is less painful at the cost of our opponent getting to choose what dies. However, with so many other removal and discard effects to cut down on the cards our opponent has in play, Sheoldred's Edict is pretty much a targeted removal in the Waste Not deck. Board wipes are played in smaller main deck numbers with so many single target ways to kill things, but are still needed against the aggressive lists. Extinction Event is the current Wrath effect of choice thanks to the Exile clause getting rid of the recursive threats in the format like Arclight Phoenix, while also making sure that Amalia and friends can't return to the ranks later on. Deadly Cover-Up also sees some play for a slightly different reason, as this 5-mana board wipe just destroys cards. With so many spells in our yard, collecting evidence for the extra effect of Cover-Up should be a breeze, allowing us to surgically extract every copy of a card from our opponent's deck so long as it was in their graveyard when the cover-up was cast. It doesn't have to die because of the cover-up, and there's no restriction on card type, so we can remove instants, sorceries, or even lands this way. Cling to Dust is a 1-mana way to ensure that something we've discarded or killed never comes back. The upside of the exile effect is that we either get to gain some life if we exile a creature, or draw a card if we exile a non-creature. This alone is pretty good, but the real key to Cling is the fact that it can be repeated thanks to Escape. With so many spells being cast and discarding our own cards to things like Liliana's +1, Cling can be used multiple times over the course of a game as a way to bait out a bad attack by gaining life, or remove something in response to, say, a reanimation effect. 2 specific artifacts pop up in Waste Not lists for slightly different reasons. Reckoner Bankbuster is a powerful card against mid-range and control decks thanks to the coveted Draw a Card line of text, while also being a way to give us a pilot token and a treasure token later on, and a 4/4 beater that is immune to opposing Go for the Throats.
Mazemind Tome is a cheaper option as it can scry for free instead of paying 2 to draw a card, and can only be activated a similar amount of times as Bankbuster before it also pops, gaining us 4 life. While Bankbuster is great for grinds, Mazemind Tome cares more about the now and is seeing a bit more play thanks to an increase in aggro decks in the Pioneer meta. While some lists are lighter than creatures on others, like mine, I hate playing too many creatures in Waste Not, there are some staple creatures that you can expect to see from the Waste Not decks. They can't always just kill people with zombies, you know? Sheoldred the Apocalypse is a no-brainer for a deck that is mono-black and works extremely well with our resource taxing game plan. Sheoldred slowly ticks down our opponent's life total every turn, even without attacking, while simultaneously punishing them hard for trying to draw cards to get out of our resource lockdown. At the same time, she stonewalls aggro decks and buffers our own life total as Waste Not and Cling to Dust draw us more ways to punish our opponents. Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal is another haymaker in the Waste Not decks that not only benefits from discarding, but causes it as well. A big 4/4 flying lifelinker is decent enough at closing a game out on its own, but the Bat God also triggers a discard effect whenever it attacks. If our opponent can't discard, we get to draw a card. If they do discard and it's a land, we end up with a 1/1 flying bat to add to our clock. The best part about Aklazot's is the fact that it can't ever die, as going to the graveyard from the battlefield has it return as a flipped land card that can transform back into the Bat God if our opponent has 1 or fewer cards in hand. Sounds perfect for our deck. Kervek the Punisher is a new addition some decks are trying out, as just about every spell in our deck triggers a crime. Targeting with discard? Crime. Using a removal spell? Crime. Liliana -2? Crime. The list goes on, and Kervek is here to record it all. When we commit these crimes, we get a chance to exile a black card from our graveyard and copy it. We have the chance to cast the copy right then and there, which costs us the normal mana cost and 2 life to do so. Important to note, this isn't limited to instants or sorceries. This is any black card. So we can get redundant Waste Nots, Sheoldred, and removal in a pinch. Kervek is also one of the few cards in our deck that synergizes with our discard spells after the opponent is empty-handed. Just because they are hellbent doesn't mean they can't be targeted with a duress, which allows Kervek to copy something more impactful from our graveyard. Hostile Investigator is the other new Outlaws card showing up in lists, and it also cares about making crimes. In addition to committing the crime when it enters, making our opponent discard a card, whenever a card is discarded, we get to investigate, which gives us a clue token. While this only happens once each turn, the clue tokens start to stack up quickly and give us an advantage in cards I mentioned being important earlier. Staying ahead of cards in hand is incredibly important when we're trying to turn the corner in a game, and Investigator is an all-star for that. It also synergizes great with one of our lands, Gaia Reach Sanitarium, as we can activate that on our opponent's turn to get 2 clues in a turn cycle. Speaking of, lands in the Waste Not deck are incredibly important, as they are probably the best way for us to stay ahead in resources during our matches, which isn't typical for a deck. With most lists running 26 total, a lot of our lands are going to operate like spells during our opponent's turn. Let's bring back a card we mentioned briefly just a couple seconds ago. Gaia Reach Sanitarium is the big all-star of our mana base as a colorless land with an ability that makes both players draw and discard a card. This is the best way to quote-unquote soft lock our opponents out of the game once we get them hellbent, as any sort of effects to scry or stack their deck can be met with an instant speed activation to force a draw discard. It's also a hard to interact with, repeatable discard spell when the game is earlier on and there are still lots of cards in hand for us to attack. Castle Lochthwain is another clutch land that Waste Not has access to, as the card allows us to draw a card for the painful price of some life. This isn't too painful when the game has gone on for a few turns, as we'll often have few to no cards in hand when we activate it. This card advantage engine is crucial to staying in front of our opponent's resources, as we're hoping to deny their card draw spells and keep drawing cards on our own by just using a land. Field of Ruin and Demolition Field are the other colorless lands in our mana base that add to our resource denial theme. Now, it's no secret that Pioneer decks have a lot of non-basic lands in their lists, and only a limited number of basics, if any at all. This means that using either of these land destruction lands can lock them out of a color they need for casting spells, or Stone Rain them straight up. Most importantly, these cards are the best way for the Waste Not deck to enable Revolt, allowing us to search for the untapped swamp we need to Fatal Push for full value. Hive of the Eye Tyrant is the creature land of choice for our deck, which makes a lot of sense for being mono black, but also because it can exile cards from our opponent's graveyard as an attack trigger. Menace and a 3-power attacker is nothing to scoff at either, as this land and a zombie or two can quickly add up the damage to close out games. Sunken Citadel is in our deck as a way to cheat on the activation costs of our utility lands. Citadel can tap for 2 mana when it's activating the ability of another land, so our Sanitarium and Land Destruction are effectively 1 mana to activate, while a Castle is 2 and a Hive is 3. Freeing up some extra lands this way allows for us to continue using our mana for utility while keeping up a crucial 1 or 2 we need for instant speed interaction. Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, seems like a silly inclusion for an all-black deck, but it's really needed when you look at just how many colorless lands we have. It's also important for Castle Locthwain, as it needs another swamp in play already in order to enter the battlefield untapped. Thankfully, Urborg gives all lands on the battlefield the swamp land type, meaning we don't have to mulligan away hands with no block mana or no untapped mana for our early turns if we have an Urborg. Finally, my favorite part of the mana base, so many swamps. Depending on how many of the other lands you're playing, you can expect to run between 8 to 10 swamps in your Waste Not list. Personally, I am running 8, but it seems like 9 is the new magic number to run, cutting down on one of the colorless field effects to make room for it. Also, pro tip, if you mismatch all of your swamps, you inflict additional psychic damage on your opponent. Sideboards for Waste Not are going to be full of extra ways to remove threats and shut down our opponent's game plans. Our remaining copies of Duress reside here, ready to come in to absolutely demolish combo and control decks, going up to 8 1-mana discard spells in our list. Cut Down is Fatal Push at home, but seeing more inclusion thanks to the aggressive decks like Prowess seeing more play, while extra copies of your favorite version of the 2-mana removal spell can also find slots in our sideboard for pretty much the same reason. Again, Go for the Throat seems to be the best here because it doesn't cost us life and it doesn't care about counters on the creatures. Reckoner Bankbuster has extra copies in the sideboard even when lists are choosing to main deck Maze Mind Tome instead. The power of the card has in mid-range and control matches is undeniable, and the small upside of being a creature eventually is something decks might not expect to combat when you're predominantly full of spells. Unlicensed Hearse and Ashiok Dreamrender see play as Graveyard Hate, while Ashiok has the upside of also shutting down decks like Niv to Light and Amalia combo that want to search their library for key cards. Of note, Ashiok only prevents effects your opponent's play that cause a search, so you sadly cannot Stone Rain someone with a field effect and an Ashiok in play. Additional copies of Extinction Event or Deadly Cover-Up sometimes make the sideboard, but Path of Peril is ubiquitous as a low-cost answer to aggro decks flooding the board with 1 and 2 mono creatures. The fact that Path can be played a turn earlier than all our other board wipe options makes it the best card in this slot for these specific aggressive matchups. Invoke Despair, while still on the ban list in Standard, is on the sideboard list in Waste Not decks as a way to really punish people for discarding lands to Waste Not. In reality, the card itself is one of the best ways black decks can deal with specific enchantments, while also providing value against creatures and planeswalkers. The worst case scenario for this 5-mana spell is deal 6, draw 3, which seems pretty solid for a deck wanting to stay ahead on resources. A lot of decks are going to have to counterspell this card to keep you from refueling, which might be hard if you've already hit them with a few discard spells. Graveyard Trespasser and Kalidas, Trader of Get, come in as ways to punish graveyard decks and hate on aggro lists alike. Trespasser's ward cost works very nicely with Waste Not, getting us something in the process even if it dies, while Kalidas can absorb the zombies we get from our enchantment to become a hulking, life-linking menace of a creature. Not with menace, just a problem. Kalidas can also make zombies of his own with all of our removal spells and exiles the creatures we kill for good in the process. Finally, a few decks have been playing some interesting cards, although these aren't in every list out there. Knight of Dust Shadow is an anti-Amalia card that prevents the life gain aspect of their combo while offering a mana sink for any extra Waste Not mana that you generate. Meanwhile, Davriel Rogue Shadow Mage is a card that I personally love, as it adds an aspect of the modern version of these decks to this list. Brought in the same matchups that you want just more discard against, Davriel's static ability deals 2 damage to your opponent on their upkeep if they have 1 or less cards in hand, adding a small clock onto your opponent that adds up quickly alongside a Shieldred in play. The way you're going to approach the Waste Not deck will depend on the matchup that you're currently playing against. However, there are some general lines and play patterns that we can go over so you can have some of the best practices in your head for when you start playing. Now, there isn't really a nut draw to a deck like Waste Not, at least not one the deck itself is going to be presenting. Because we want to attack our opponent's resources while buffering our own, any sort of hand with a Waste Not and a couple of discard spells is going to be keepable. Sometimes. Here's a thought experiment. Let's go over one potential quote-unquote nut draw for the deck, which I'll call Bye-Bye Phoenix hand. This consists of a turn 1 using Duress or Thoughtseize to make sure that the Phoenix player doesn't have their singleton Spell Pierce in hand. Turn 2, you throw out your Waste Not, and turn 3, you hit them with a devastating Go Blank, potentially following it up with another discard spell if they get rid of a land. Now, this line is punishing against Phoenix, but probably leaves us dead on board against Prowess or Heroic. So unlike the other decks we've discussed, these hands are way more specific compared to, say, Rakdos Vampires and their nut draws. Now, you could look at our original hand and replace some of the discard spells with removal spells, which would then be great against an aggro deck, but awful against a combo or control matchup. So instead of going through every single sort of quote-unquote best opener against the whole field, let's take a look at what a keepable Waste Not hand looks like. Here's a sample hand with a Waste Not in it, alongside 2 lands, 2 discard spells, and 2 removal spells. This would be a Sneep, a snap keep for me on the blind. Our hand has its Namesake engine card, and 2 potential plays for any type of deck that we might encounter. Now, here's a hand that looks a little different. We have 3 lands, the same number and type of spells, but no Waste Not. This is a pretty powerful hand, but we might fizzle out without a way to generate advantages on board or through card draw. Still, this would be something I'd keep more times than not. The classic, why does my deck hate me draw. We have our Waste Not, we have 2 discard spells and a removal spell, but all of our lands are colorless. Hands like this are really tough because you assume that we'll draw into a black source sooner or later. But with this hand, our 4 castles will enter tapped, so they aren't really the best. We have 8 to 10 swamps, an Urborg, and 2 Hive of the Eye Tyrants we ideally want on turn 2, but will enter tapped on turn 3 or later. So while we're about 79.4% to draw an untapped black source by turn 3 on the play, we'll have missed a big window early game to set up and we'll be behind. I pitch these hands in favor of a new 6. Basically, your best plays involve having at least 1 of each type of card your deck has in your opening hand. Discard, removal, engine, and potentially creature, as well as 2 or more lands, preferably at least 1 untapped black source. You can mix and match these things, but in general, I wouldn't mulligan a hand like this unless it was something like, oops, all creatures, and not enough spells. One of the biggest things you'll have to fight the urge to do is throw out a discard spell on turn 1 when you have a Waste Not in hand. Now, that sounds a little strange, but having Waste Not starting to generate advantages ASAP is crucial to our game plan. However, this doesn't mean you always hold the discard until Waste Not is in play. For example, playing Waste Not when you have Duress in hand on the draw versus Vampires seems like suicide unless you want to have a Shieldred's Edict in your hand alongside that. You're going to want to nab that Sorin even if we don't have another discard spell yet to make sure that Waste Not can do additional things. These decisions are much easier with multiple discard effects in hand, as you can use one before and one after deploying Waste Not with little punishment. We are going to need to end the game eventually, so making sure that our creatures survive is going to always be in the back of our minds. The easiest way to do so is wait until our opponent is empty-handed or close to it in order to deploy our threats. Aclazotz comes in handy here, as the amount of exile removal is often low and board wipe based in Pioneer. So unless the enemy is packing Vanishing Verse in their list, the Bat God can die and come back frequently enough. This doesn't mean we can just slam it on curve though, unless we need to survive with the lifelink. Be aware that our creature count is lower, and don't be afraid to not attack if you smell a Blessed Alliance or a block plus burn spell. You should also be mindful to your spell selection when using discard and removal. On the blind, Thoughtseize is more likely to hit something in an opponent's hand, whereas Duress saves us life if we see our opponent throw down a Stomping Ground and a Swift Spear on turn 1. Likewise, using a Fatal Push on smaller threats like a Blood Tithe Harvester while saving Go for the Throat for something larger like a Vein Ripper will ensure that we always have the correct answer in our hand. Sometimes you'll be forced to act and use a spell you'd rather save, but we can't really change how and when that happens. Instead, we should be maximizing our plays to try and avoid these situations as much as possible. The last thing to remember is the timing of your cards. This is relevant for things like Gaia Reach Sanitarium, which can be used at instant speed. Stopping an empty-handed opponent on their draw step only allows them to cast instants in their hand as a response, which can sometimes snag a threat that they've drawn. Too bad we don't have Narset Parter Avails to lock them out of the game this way. Likewise, if you see them scry to the top with something at the end of your turn, you can do it on their upkeep to force them to quote-unquote mill it if they're empty-handed. Don't forget your Shieldred triggers, and you can use card draw effects wisely when they may have removal for it. Something like Castle Locthwain at low life can be deadly to yourself if you're expecting to gain 2 life and instead just lose out on it and then die on a crackback. Waste Not is in an interesting spot right now in the metagame because the deck hasn't really been great due to the way that the deck is heavily matchup dependent. However, the stars have seemingly aligned in Pioneer's metagame skies. Waste Not is a top tier deck almost entirely based on the fact that it eats the other top decks for breakfast. With favorable matchups into Izzet Phoenix, Rakdos Vampires, Lotus Field combo, and Azorius Control. Any deck trying to keep specific cards against you is going to have a bad time. The other half of our deck is pure removal and, importantly, sacrifice effects. So decks that are trying to keep one big creature alive or build up a Voltroned up one like Boros Heroic are also favorable for Waste Not. There are some matches that are a little bit more of a toss-up or even slightly unfavorable for you. Decks that can put a lot of things into play early on or prevent you from getting rid of their key pieces quick enough are going to turn into grind fests. The decks that can play off the top of their library are also rough, as that's the one zone our deck can't influence. Amalia combo is the worst offender of these, as the combo can hit the board early, and even if we deal with the key pieces there, they can Court of Calling or Collected Company to just do it all over again. Taxing our mana to use removal so we can't discard their restock plan is pretty rough for us. Aggro decks like Prowess and Mono Red can also be a little bit harder despite our deck being chock full of removal. If they can go wider rather than taller, we might not have the right removal spells for their board state and we can get toppled over. However, post-sideboard, Path of Peril really helps to shore up these weaknesses. Decks that straight up beat us are going to be the ones that either don't care and can deal with our discard packages like tempo decks, or ones that can pull things out of their library to beat us. Enigmatic Fires is a big one, as the predominant engine is enchantment based and we do not have removal for those outside of getting it in their hand or Invoke Despair on turn 5. Azorius Spirits can be another rough matchup for the Waste Not deck, as it has impactful spells, but is still mostly creature-based. Rattlechain specifically can shut us down, and our Edict effects aren't that great when they can flash in a 1/1 to just soak it up. The worst matchup by far, though, is the Niv to Light deck, as they have so many ways to not just pull cards from their deck, but reuse things that we've made them discard early on. It's like they just don't even care about us at all, man.
Now, since the deck does operate like a control deck does, you're going to have to get used to playing a slow and steady game with Waste Not and not trying to just kind of blow everything on your opponent's hand right from the get-go. It can be challenging to learn when you need to hold a discard spell versus letting that turn 1 Thoughtseize rip like a Beyblade. Learning what your deck can and cannot beat and when it can handle it is a key part to playing the Waste Not deck. This is both equal parts learning the ins and outs of your deck, so much that it is learning what the other decks have and how they can use them and when they need to deploy them. Because of this, I can't really in good faith recommend you pick up the deck for an RCQ despite all of its good matchups on paper without really playing the deck for a while first. I'm tempted to say that you want to play just as many matches as possible with the deck before an RCQ, but if you've played Pioneer before or you've played other control decks, you at least have some knowledge on the other decks in the format already, or some knowledge on playing a little bit of a slower control-y style of game. If you are brand new to the format, however, you're going to want to play at least 30 matches with the deck before deciding to take it to a competitive event. I suggest that many matches so you have the chance of seeing each of the metagame decks online or at your LGS at least once, if not more. That way, you can at least sort of know what to expect and how to attack them later on. So, what do you think? Are you excited to sleeve up the mono black Waste Not deck, or would you rather not waste time and play something else? See what I did there? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and while you're down there, give a thumbs up to the video as that helps me with the mighty algorithm gods of YouTube. As always, you can tap that subscribe button to stay up to date on the latest deck techs, metagame analysis, and in general, Magic the Gathering content. See you later.